This is Chapter 1, Introducing Social Psychology. These are my notes from the reading by Vaughan and Hogg, Social Psychology 8th edition textbook. So, what is social psychology? It is the scientific investigation of how people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. It involves behavior, which is basically what people do that can be measured objectively. Also, it is interested in feelings, thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, intentions, and goals. It relies on science, obviously, which is a method for studying involving collecting of data to test hypotheses. There's theory, which is a set of interrelated concepts and principles that explain a phenomenon, and there's the data itself, which is publicly verified observations. Social psychology has close neighbors in, or rather it sits at crossroads with many other disciplines such as economics, individual psychology, social anthropology, sociology, sociolinguistics, language, communication, and cognitive psychology. It is concerned with how organizations and groups function, and how economics, language, demographics, and individuals interact with each other. Topics, as in like subtopics within the branch of social psychology, include conformity, discrimination, stereotyping, bargaining, sexism, racism, small groups, social categories, intergroup relations, prejudice, sexism, racism, conflict, harmony, leadership, communication, and language, as well as altruism and aggression. Research methods, basically the scientific methods such as creating hypotheses, which are empirically testable predictions about what co-occurs with what or what causes that. There's also confirmation bias, which is a tendency to seek, interpret, and create information verifying existing explanations for the cause of an event. Basically, we want to try and not use confirmation bias, as in not try and limit confirmation bias in order to falsify the hypothesis. And yeah, experiments are just testing the hypothesis as the independent variable, which are features of a situation that change their own accord or can be manipulated by an experimenter to have effects on the dependent variable. There is a dependent variable, which are variables that change as a consequence of changes in the independent variable, and there are confounding variables where two or more independent variables co-vary in such a way that it is impossible to know which has caused the effect. Usually, experimentation occurs in a laboratory, which is a place or room where data is collected by experimental methods. And things like fMRI or functional magnetic resonance imaging is used, where basically it's a method used in social neuroscience to measure where electrochemical activity in the brain is occurring. Another important point is external validity or mundane realism, which is a similarity between circumstances surrounding an experiment and circumstances encountered in everyday life. There's also internal validity or experimental realism, which is the psychological impact of manipulations in an experiment. Subject effects are the effects that are not spontaneous, but it's owing to demand characteristics, which I'll get into a second, or its subject effects could be due to the participant wishing to please the experimenter. Demand characteristics are features of an experiment that seem to demand a certain response. There's also experimental effects, which are the effects produced or influenced by clues to the hypotheses under examination, inadvertently communicated by the experimenter. In order to reduce the experimenter effects, you have the double-blind procedure, which is where the experimenter is unaware of the experimental conditions. Field experiments are used by social psychologists to conduct observations in a naturalistic setting, and it's where in certain situations it is impractical to experiment in a laboratory. It has less control over extraneous variables, and random assignment is difficult. Non-experimental methods. So in some circumstances it is impossible to conduct an experiment to test a hypothesis. You would need to use other methods like correlation studies in which changes in one variable are reliably mapped onto changes in another variable, but it cannot be determined which of the two variables caused the change. So just remember, correlation is not equal causation. There's archival research, which are non-experimental methods involving assemblies of data/reports collected by others. Case studies are in-depth analyses of a single case or individual. There's quantitative research, which are closely related to case studies, where one analyzes like the behavior that occurs naturally, so usually like in a field experiment. And on that note, there's discourse, which are entire communicative events or episodes located in a situational and socio-historical context, and discourse analysis, which are a set of methods to analyze text, naturally occurring language, to understand the meaning and significance. Next, you have survey research, which involves structured interviews like open and closed-ended questions. The method is subject to experimenter bias, subject bias, and evaluation apprehension. Demand characteristics can remain, and it can be influenced by poorly constructed questionnaires. Field studies are non-obtrusive observations, where the observer takes field notes of situations and has the experiment, but they do have experimenter bias. So it's kind of very subjective, and you can only make poor generalizations. Data and analysis. Statistics are used, which are numerical procedures performed on data to investigate the magnitude or the significance effects. There's t-tests in statistics, which are procedures testing statistical significance of effects, where the mean for one condition is greater than the mean for the other. And you have statistical significance, which is an effect where if statistically significant, it reveals that it is unlikely to occur by chance alone, at least like 1 in 20 times. And types of analysis undertaken include types of data obtained, like binary responses, continuous variables, ordinal variables, etc., as well as methods used to obtain data, which are controlled experiments, open-ended interviews, and participant observation archival search. The purpose of research in a specific case is to test treatment or to see the differences or test whether the hypothesis is right or wrong, etc. There are research ethics to consider, which include maintaining reputation in research, not to plagiarize or cheat or basically make up data, as well as considering physical and psychological welfare of your participants. Things required include respect for privacy, which is the need to maintain that the evidence is confidential and participants are anonymous. There's also the use of deception, which you need to manipulate people's cognitive or cognition, feeling, behavior in order to investigate something without biases. Participants need to be naive to test certain hypotheses. There's also informed consent, which is required, where one requires the written contract expressing rights in an experiment, such as the ability to withdraw or withhold information without consequences. Then there's a debriefing at the end, which is a detailed explanation of the experiment and its broader theoretical and applied context to get rid of the deception and any misunderstanding. Theories and theorizing. Good theories should reveal truth, describe specific terms of more general abstracted principles, make an advance on existing theory, and can have an application to the real world. Theories seek to understand the relationships relationship of variables and rests on formal statements about association between concepts. They should be framed in such a way that they can be tested empirically, which means they must be falsifiable. For example, theories look at intergroup relations and social change, motivational processes associated with group membership and group behavior, social influences and conformity, processes within groups, cognitive processes associated with self-conception and social perception. Theories in social psychology include meta-theory, which is a set of interrelated concepts and principles concerning which theories or types of theory are appropriate. Behaviorism was proposed by Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. They were radical behaviorists, since they explained observable behavior in terms of reinforcement schedules without recourse in intervening unobtrusive constructs. Basically, they ignored cognition. Neo-behaviorists are ones who attempt to explain observable behavior in terms of the contextual factors and unobservable intervening constructs such as beliefs, feelings, and motives. There's also a reinforcement effect model of interpersonal attraction, where we grow to like people who are associated with positive experiences, so basically like people who like us. There's the social exchange theory, where the nature of social interactions depends on people's evaluations of rewards and costs. Social modeling is a broadly behaviorist perspective, where one learns vicariously by imitating behavior reinforced in others. Then you have drive theory, which is how the strength of learned responses influences whether we perform better or worse in front of an audience. Cognitive psychology is another big theory, which explains behavior in terms of how people actively interpret and represent their experiences, and then plan actions. For an example, Lewin, 1951, conducted proposed field theory, which dealt with how people's cognitive representations of features of the social environment produce motivational forces to behave in specific ways. There's also social neuroscience, which explores brain activity associated with social cognition and social psychological processes and phenomena. Evolutionary social psychology, which is the extensive evolutionary psychological views that basically explain complex social behavior as adaptive processes in helping the individual, kin, species as a whole to survive. There's evolutionary psychology, which is the theoretical approach that explains the usefulness for certain psychological traits, such as memory, perception, language, personality, as adaptation through natural selection, personality and individual differences. Social psychologists, they consider personality to be a partial explanation because there is actually little evidence for stable personality traits. People have behaved differently depending on different contexts slash situations. Personality is derived as behavior, consistency across contexts, rather than being an explanation of behavior, which is example such as why do some people resist social contextual influences on behavior. Collectivist theories, they focus on people as products of their location in the matrix of social categories and groups that make up society. People behave more so on internalized group norms that influence behavior in specific contexts. For an example, McDougall's 1920 theory of group mind stated that people change the way they think process information and act when in groups, which is different from interpersonal behavior. Social psychology in crisis. Meta-theoretical debates. Social psychology was overly reductionist, i.e. by explaining social behavior mainly in terms of individual psychology. They failed to address the essential social nature of human experience. Social psychology was overly positivistic, i.e. adhered to a model of science that was distorted, inappropriate, and misleading. Reductionism and levels of explanation are used in social psychology. Reductionism is the explanation of phenomenon in terms of language and concepts of a lower level of analysis, usually with a loss of explanatory power. So society is explained in terms of groups, interpersonal processes, and cognition, for example. And basically you can try to explain away things due to asocial, intra-psychic, cognitive, and motivational processes. In essence, you're basically ignoring the individual behavior choices. There's levels of explanation, which are types of concepts, mechanisms, and language used to explain a phenomenon. One way to get around reductionism is to introduce these levels of explanation. Another theory is positivism, or rather another perspective, which is basically the non-critical acceptance of science as the only way to arrive at true knowledge as science, through science. Social psychology was criticized for being too positivistic, in which it's harder to achieve a level of objectivity since we are studying ourselves. So basically we all have intrinsic biases. There's been a proposition of the post-positivism perspective, which includes social constructionism, humanistic psychology, and ecogenic, as well as discourse analysis. Subjectivity is considered a virtue of good research, and operational definitions are used, such as defining theoretical terms in a way that allows it to be manipulated and measured. For example, aggression, altruism, and leadership. Historical contexts. They include social psychology in the 19th century, which had Anglo-European influences. There's a word called Völker psychology, which is German, and it's an early precursor to social psychology, which studied the collective mind in Germany, as I said before. Then it became manifested in this idea of the group mind. There's also has been the rise of experimentation, which is the intentional manipulation of independent variables in order to investigate effects on one or more dependent variables. Wundt He basically set the scene for the experimental basis of psychology in Germany, and this spread to American universities. Then you have Watson, who was a behaviorist and who only focused on studying physical things, behavior. Allport argued that social psychology would flourish if it became an experimental science. Then you have Murphy and Murphy, who wrote Experimental Social Psychology, and the first experiment in social psychology was by Norman Trickler in 1898, who conducted a study that is often cited as social psychology's first experiment, an experiment on social facilitation. This was interested in competitive cyclists and wanted to test performance, whether one was riding alone or in competition. Attitude scaling is the refinement of methods for constructing scales to measure attitudes, and this branched into fields of sociological social psychology. Pioneered by Thomas and Nanicki, 1918, defined social psychology as the scientific study of attitudes rather than the social behavior. Studies of social groups were pioneered by Lewin, who was the father of experimental social psychology, who put emphasis into the study of group processes and studied the effect of leadership. There's attribution, where people try to make sense of their lives in different ways. For example, superstitions like palmistry, astrology, etc. And there's many famous journals, which I'm not going to go into. A lot of these definitions I'm putting forward in the next couple of videos. I probably will also repeat them again and again, which will help to memorize these terms. Thanks for watching.